The Test by Angelica Gibbs. On the afternoon, Marion took her second driving test. Mrs. Erickson went with her. It's probably better to have someone a little older with you, Mrs. Erickson said as Marion slipped into the driver's seat beside her. Besides, last time your cousin Bill made you nervous, talking too much on the way.
Yes, ma'am,
Marion said in her soft, unaccented voice.
They probably do like it better if a white person shows up with you.
Oh, I don't think it's that, Mrs. Erickson began, and subsided after a glance at the girl's set profile. Marion drove the car slowly through the shady suburban streets. It was one of the first hot days of June, and when they reached the boulevard, they found it crowded with cars headed for the beaches. Do you want me to drive? Mrs. Erickson asked. I'll be glad to if you're feeling a little jumpy. Marion shook her head. Mrs. Erickson watched her dark, competent hands and wondered for the thousandth time how the house had ever managed to get along without her, or how she had lived through those early years when her household had been presided over by a series of slatternly white girls who had considered housework demeaning and the care of children an added insult. You'll drive beautifully, Marion, she said. Now, don't think of the last time anybody would slide on a steep hill on a wet day like that.
It takes 4 mistakes to flunk you,
Marion said.
I don't remember doing all the things the inspector marked down on my blank.
People say that they only want you to slip them a little something, Mrs. Erickson said doubtfully.
No,
Marion said.
That would only make it worse, Mrs. Erickson.
The car turned right at a traffic signal into a side road and slid up to the curb at the rear of the short line of parked cars. The inspectors had not arrived yet. You have the papers? Mrs. Erickson asked. Marion took them out of her bag. Her learner's permit, the car registration, and her birth certificate. They settled down to the dreary business of waiting. It will be marvelous to have someone dependable to drive the children to school every day, Mrs. Erickson said. Marion looked up from the list of driving requirements she had been studying.
It'll make things simpler at the house, won't it?
She said. Oh, Marion, Mrs. Erickson exclaimed. If I could only pay you half of what you're worth.
Now, Mrs. Erickson,
Marion said firmly. They looked at each other and smiled with affection. 2 cars with official insignia on their doors stopped across the street. The inspectors leaped out, very brisk and military in their neat uniforms. Marion's hands tightened on the wheel.
That's the one that flunked me last time,
she whispered, pointing to a stocky, self-important man who had begun to shout directions at the driver at the head of the line.
Oh, Mrs. Erickson.
Now, Marion, Mrs. Erickson said. They smiled at each other again, rather weakly. The inspector, who finally reached their car, was not the stocky one, but a genial, middle-aged man who grinned broadly as he thumbled over their papers. Mrs. Erickson started to get out of the car. Do you want to come along? The inspector said. Mandy and I don't mind company. Mrs. Erickson was bewildered for a moment. No, she said, and stepped to the curb. I might make Marion self-conscious. She's a fine driver, Inspector. Sure thing, the inspector said, winking at Mrs. Erickson. He slid into the seat beside Marion. Turn right at the corner, Mandy Lou. From the curb, Mrs. Erickson watched the car move smoothly up the street. The inspector made notations in a small black book. Age? He inquired presently as they drove along.
27.
He looked at Marion out of the corner of his eye. Old enough to have quite a flock of pickaninnies, eh? Marion did not answer. Left at the corner, the inspector said, and parked between that truck and the green Buick. The 2 cars were very close together, but Marion squeezed in between them without too much maneuvering. Driven before, Mandy Lou? The inspector asked.
Yes, sir. I had a license for 3 years in Pennsylvania.
Why do you want to drive a car?
My employer needs me to take her children to and from school.
Sure you don't really want to sneak out nights to see some young blood? The inspector asked. He laughed as Marion shook her head. Let's see you take a left at the corner and then turn around in the middle of the next next block, Inspector said. He began to whistle Swanee River. Make you homesick? He asked. Marion put out her hand, swung around neatly in the street, and headed back in the direction from which they had come.
No,
She said.
I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
The inspector feigned astonishment. Y'all ain't Southern, he said. Well, dog my cats if I didn't think y'all come from down yonder,
No, sir.
Marion said. Turn onto Main Street here and let's see how you all does in heavier traffic. They followed a line of cars along Main Street for several blocks until they came in sight of a concrete bridge, which arched high over the railroad tracks. Read that sign at the end of the bridge, the inspector said.
Proceed with caution. Dangerous in slippery weather.
Marion said. Y'all sure can read fine, the inspector exclaimed. Where'd you learn to do that, Mandy?
I got my college degree last year.
Marion said. Her voice was not quite steady. As the car crept up the slope of the bridge, the inspector burst out laughing. He laughed so hard he could scarcely give his next direction. Stop there, he said, wiping his eyes. Then start her up again. Mandy got her degree, did she? Dog my cats! Marion pulled up beside the curb. She put the car in neutral, pulled on the emergency, waited for a moment, and then put the car into gear again. Her face was set. As she released the brake, her foot slipped off the clutch pedal, and the engine stalled. Now, Mistress Mandy, the inspector said, remember your degree?
Damn you!
Marion cried. She started the car with a jerk. The inspector lost his joviality in an instant. Return to the starting place, please, he said, and made 4 very black crosses at random in the squares on Marion's application blank. Mrs. Erickson was waiting at the curb where they had left her. As Marion stopped the car, the inspector jumped out and brushed past her, his face purple. What happened? Mrs. Erickson asked, looking after him with alarm. Marion stared down at the wheel, and her lip trembled. Oh, Marion, again? Marion nodded.
In a sort of different way,
She said, and slid over to the right-hand side of the car.